Hello, thanks for tuning in. Welcome to EnergyTech Essentials from the Net Zero Technology Centre, the UK's energy centre, to try and develop new technologies. I'm here today with our valued partners at Quensh, where we're going to introduce in just a second. And the theme of this session is all about health, safety, and HR for scaling startups. And the purpose of these sessions is all to try and provide support, resources, insight to help those early stage ventures where you've got a challenge to try and learn, get a little bit of insight, and develop your startup further. It's part of a series where we're covering all sorts from technology development to HR to health and safety to marketing, branding, pitching, investment, various other topics. But as I say today, it's all about those stages. If you are an energy startup, maybe you've just got your first lab, maybe you're building out your team, maybe you're building out your manufacturing. That involves hiring people, that involves building out your resources, and it involves making sure things are safe. So we're delighted to be joined by Jamie and Donna from Quensh. Welcome to you both. How are you both doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having us. Looking forward to today.
Excellent. Well, we'll maybe kick off with a first open question, and you could tell us a little bit more about yourselves and Quench as you do that. But an opening question, you work with a lot of different companies for both the HR hats, but also the health and safety hats. What are some of the maybe red flags that you might see from some of these early stage companies as they're starting to look at their HR, look at their health and safety?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned there, we're a consultancy business, and we have a large client base spreading from everything from startup businesses to corporate entities, everything in between. So we've got a really good position where we can see lots of different businesses throughout the supply chain. And from our experience over the years since we've been going since 2006, there are a lot of common red flags, and a lot of people don't realize how common they are, and they think it's very specific to themselves. But the top one from my perspective, from the health and safety side of things, is the starting point of everything in health and safety is risk assessments. Everyone either thinks they have risk assessments, or they see a piece of paper that says risk assessment on it, but having a suitable and sufficient risk assessment that people in the workplace know about, and are actually adhering to, and it's actually accurate, is the starting blocks for everything else. Other bits and pieces are basic processes, basic training for the business. So some of bits we'll delve into throughout this show, but having basic processes in place for controlling your work, for telling people what to do and how to do it, basic training, whether it's manual handling training or DSE assessment training, or even a basic company induction. Folk take that for granted, and it's often the case that most businesses, especially startups, oversee it. Poor change management is another hot topic. Understanding just how to manage change, again, specifically for startup businesses. It can often be kind of off the cuff and very fast paced, but failing to manage change will potentially have quite a significant knock-on effect to clients and therefore revenue, Change isn't just necessarily technical, it can be organizational and things like that as well. Again, specifically for health and safety, a clear ownership of who's managing health and safety in the organization as well. Small businesses often work very well together, have a very good teamwork methodology, but having a clear ownership of someone taking ownership of health and safety, managing it on a day-to-day basis, can go leaps and bounds to making sure you keeps yourself right. And probably the last one from me is to do with, I would probably call it emergency response, but that could cover everything from emergency response: what happens if there's a fire, what happens if there's an accident, but more importantly, what happens when there is an accident, learning from your mistakes, looking after your employees. There's direct legal requirements with regards to that. So if we don't take that on as a business, you could be setting yourself up for a lot of more future hassles and heartaches and danger to your employees as well. And obviously from a HR perspective, you'll have a lot of similar kind of flags as well.
Absolutely. As Jamie said, we work with businesses all stages of their development, but considering some of the stresses in terms of HR, for founders, is getting to grips with compliance, the legislative framework within the UK, and also combining that with strategic HR practice so the business can scale up and grow, with the foundations in place. So we get involved a lot in helping founders, startups to develop contracts of employment, basic suite of HR policies that are fit for purpose, in line with the nature of their business and future growth plans. really important for founders is setting that culture. And culture is formed by the values and behavior set by the founders initially, and then they're relying on strong management capability to maintain that positive workplace culture as they grow. And that's often quite a scary part, I think, for founders, relying on that next tier of management to lead and manage their people and continue to build that community and positive workplace culture. So, even at an early stage, thinking about succession planning, thinking about building competency, thinking about founder knowledge and expertise and how that can be passed on as the business grows and scales up. So those were kind of the areas, and I mean, there's plenty more. I mean, obviously, recruitment can be tricky for many founders. Often a business might start with, known candidates, perhaps people they've worked with before. But as we grow, then the business is looking for expertise and competing for talent across industry, perhaps. So that can be a bit of a minefield at times. So we get involved in businesses, supporting them from recruitment, onboarding, to developing some good, strong HR practice and procedure, helping set that positive workplace culture, helping them define values and behaviours, what good looks like, to hopefully build upon that culture as the business scales up.
Really interesting. It always scares me, but it's exciting imagining a small founder team where they really do have to wear all the hats. There's so much to consider from so many different parts. So let's unpick that. Let's imagine we've got the types of companies we work with on TechX. There's an early stage venture. There's maybe 3 or 4 founders, and we've got maybe a couple of their first hires through the door, and they're now looking at maybe getting their first lab space, or they've raised investment and they're now starting to look at, we need a few engineers, we need to build out a lab space. So let's talk about the scary legal stuff first. Okay, I'm a director of this business. I've just signed the lease on the lab. I'm now about to hire some people, and they're about to do some heavy machinery or some chemical experiments. Maybe we'll go to you, Jamie, first. Just health and safety wise, legal wise, what's the responsibilities of these founders? What are they going to have to do as they're starting to plan out that lab space from a health and safety point of view?
No, absolutely. I mean, the horrible thing about health and safety in the UK is that everyone's kings on Google or AI nowadays, which is brilliant tools, but they can equally be dangerous as well at the same time. For example, if you put in AI applicable UK health and safety legislation, it will literally come out with hundreds and hundreds of different pieces of legislation. So the key piece of advice I always give up to especially new starts is make sure the right person in their organization has got the ownership. Now, obviously, that might be an internal person that's got previous experience, but equally, there's third parties out there. That's hence why Quensh exists, for example. That will take a lot of pain away from the organization. But in essence, it's basic legal compliance. So from an employer's perspective, if they've just taken on a new premises, a new laboratory, like I mentioned, risk assessment, everything should start from a risk assessments perspective. You should have risk assessments in place for all your tasks, your activities, everything that goes on in that place. What that risk assessment will help you do thereafter is identify the different areas that you might, applicable legislation, whether it's Legionnaire as well as electricity, EIC certs for the building, pure rights for any pieces of equipment, COSH assessments, what COSH assessments are required for chemicals that may be in use. Basic building maintenance and facility maintenance is one of the key things that we always find companies trip up on, because they've not thought about the lift that they've got in the building. Do we need to service that? And is that applicable to Lola? Yeah, you have to get checked every 12 months, if not 6 months, if it's carrying people. So a lift obviously carries people. Everything down to, the water systems, the electricity, all these kind of things need taken in place. So it kind of goes back to my original point, is that it goes back to making sure you've got the right person in place, whether internal or external, that can take care of that and not get lost in it too much. Because as the business continues to grow and develop, and it starts creeping towards potentially revenue generating, the first questions clients will ask is, where's your assurance and where's your legal compliance? Because if we're going to get into the bed with you in a formal relationship, our reputation's on the line. So they will only do that if they have the confidence in you as a business being able to demonstrate that you're legally compliant, you're able to provide what you're saying you provide from an insurance product service perspective. We could sit here all day and reel off lots and lots of different legislation, whether it's risk assessment, accident investigation, emergency response, COSH, electricity, fire at work, first aid. We could go on and just keep reeling that, but it has to have a very methodical approach to it and done in the right way, because yes, there's hundreds of pieces of different legislation, but the fraction of that is applicable to your organization. But you need to do that exercise first to figure out what is applicable. And again, it's probably similar from a HR perspective as well.
Yeah, in terms of basic compliance, most of the rights in the UK are housed under the Employment Rights Act, and that sets out the requirement to issue a written statement of particulars from day one. Most employers now send that out beforehand, so everything's signed off and clear prior to the commencement date. There are certain particulars that need to go into that written statement. Often it takes the form of a contract of employment. But in addition to the basics in terms of compliance, considering a contract of employment, it's important to build in things like intellectual property clauses, confidentiality clauses to protect the business as well. In addition, an awareness of the Equality Act, another key piece of legislation, is important so that founders and their management team can build inclusive, diverse, and equitable workforces. In addition, you would want to look at a basic set of HR policies and procedures, thinking about anti-bullying and harassment, having robust policies in that particular area, but also thinking about an ED&I policy, equality, diversity and inclusion, and onto employee relations, thinking about a grievance policy for any employee concerns and a disciplinary policy for any conduct matters, and perhaps a performance management policy as well. So a small set of policies that might be housed within an employee handbook to begin with, and then further policy and procedure can build from there as the business grows and adds more structure into the organisation. So those would be the main compliance. I mean, there's far more, but those are the parts to think of initially. And obviously, prior to recruiting, always thinking about your right to work checks, checking eligibility to work in the UK, but also checking certs, checking experience levels, taking up references.
Really interesting. And even just diving in on that, Donna, I think a lot of startups are so small that they kind of think, well, there's the 3 or 4 of us directors and there's 1 or 2 people. Do we really need all these policies? That's my friend from uni, or, not always friends, but people they know, and they have this close family-like relationship where they're building this thing together, almost very scrappy startup. Legally, how early do you need to build this stuff in, and what's the consequence if they go, oh gosh, we're on our 5th or 6th hire, and now all of a sudden we don't actually have a policy for that? What happens?
Yeah, and I agree. You don't want a full set of HR policies that a big corporate would have in place. It's appropriate for the industry, for the size and scale of the organisation, perhaps for the first 2-3 years to begin with. As a minimum, to comply, an organisation would have to have at least a disciplinary procedure and a grievance procedure that's required under the Employment Rights Act. ACAS, the Advisory Conciliatory Arbitration Service, they set codes of practice in these areas, and it's really important for organisations to develop their policies in line with those codes of practice. Many founders do, and startups do recruit known people to begin with, and that's fine. I have seen instances where relationships can change over time, and even worst case sour. So it is important to set boundaries to begin with, from work and personal life, and to protect those personal relationships as well. When you're working together, culture, as well as maintaining that friendship. It's important to set out the values and behaviours that you're expecting, even from close friends that might be working with you. Getting the culture wrong from the start can derail an organisation later on. If we can set the right culture and recruit people into that positive, inclusive workplace culture to begin with, that will set the organisation in a strong footing as it grows its workforce.
Thank you. Now, picking in, Jamie, you were obviously talking about risk assessment probably being quite a powerful tool to unlock a lot of those other steps. Again, maybe being cheeky and cynical, it's one of those things that you feel like busy startups, they're trying to raise investment, they're trying to build things, they're like, it's a paperwork exercise and maybe throw it together. Hopefully not. But from your point of view, if you were coming in, what makes a really good risk assessment? Is there anything practical? How do we get startups using this? Is there, a shared place? Do they print it out and stick it on the wall? Is there color coding? What little tips have you got to say, this is how to do a really good one and how to make it actually useful?
Yeah, it's gauging your experience. I mean, the some of the horror stories we've seen in terms of risk assessments is, one, nowhere near detailed enough, but two, far too much detail. There have to be usable, practical documents. They have to be, practical. They have to be reasonable. Often the case you see copy and paste jobs. So I've got this risk assessment from the previous place I worked at. I'll just use that for using the forklift or something simple like that. Basic tools is it has to be worthwhile. It has to be usable. It has to be practical. It has to be reasonable in terms of the control measures you put in place. So if I was to walk into an organization for the first time and say, right, well, have a look at your risk assessments, the ways I would get a warm, fuzzy feeling, whether it's as a third party, as a client, or as a regulatory HSE inspector, is knowledge and understanding from top to bottom. Do you technically, legally have to sign off a risk assessment? Not necessarily, but they need to know what the control measures are. Members of staff need to know what the control measures are. So if I'm speaking to the managing director or I'm speaking to the apprentice in the workshop, they should be able to tell me, goes, yeah, we've got a risk assessment. It's in that folder. It's saved on this server. Or we did a toolbox talk on that the other day, and we had a chat about the control measures. Or we had Joe Bloggs cut his finger doing this operation, so we tweaked and updated the risk assessment. Risk assessment has to be real. Well, it's not a corporate document to be filled with lots of high level type wording, detailing this, that, and all this different pieces of legislation. It has to be real and applicable to your business, to your premises. So if your fire extinguisher is next to the canteen or next to the changing rooms, that's where your fire extinguisher is. It's not, copyright, make it too corporate or too fluffy in terms of the terminology used. And above and beyond everything else, take the most simplistic approach to it. It has to be real, like I say. And if it's not, that's usually where it will fail, and it'll become more of an unnecessary evil than an actual useful tool. And that's actually a really good way of thinking about risk assessments, is if you're sitting within your organization, you find this a nightmare or it's a burden, it's probably wrong. So you should probably take a step back and realign and have a look at doing things differently.
That's helpful. Yeah, I actually used to lecture in event management, and I used to teach a module about risk. And one of the things that came up quite often is I would be looking at students filling in their risk assessments, and they would put in their mitigations a big, what they thought would be the right thing to do. Someone will, walk around and make sure there's no loose cable. Someone will do this. And one of the things I always used to feedback was this has to be something usable. So we would often change it into a checklist. And an event is quite a good time because you've got on the day of the event, here's what we said we would do in the risk assessment. Someone will walk around, has that been done? Someone will check this, has that been done? And for event management, there's a discrete point of time. How does it work in an organization where this is day-to-day business? This is stuff that's happening every single day. What's best practice in terms of making it a living document, making sure the checks are happening, making sure people it's not just a thing where they've written it down and a year later they go, did we check the fire extinguishers every 3 weeks like we said we would? What
Absolutely.
works and what doesn't?
First of all, you need to think about it in the right way. It's a working tool. Is a risk assessment technically ever complete? Some people would argue no, because you will go through the risk assessment process. You'll, rightly you said, where you identify mitigation control measures and all that good stuff. But equally, you also identify, well, we should maybe be doing this, but we're not. There's an action. Every risk assessment might have associated action plans off the back of it. So it's almost a bit of a working document. Mm. But there's ways and means. I mean, the risk assessment should be a starting point, and it should feed out throughout throughout other elements of the organization. So morning briefings, toolbox talks, general meetings, whether it's safety meetings, operational meetings, all these different elements should feed into this. So, for example, if we're conducting an ongoing operational meeting, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever it might be, you might be discussing, right, we've got this job going on, we've got that job going on. You don't necessarily need to sit there and specifically say, we've got this job going on, here's this risk assessment, here's this risk assessment, here's this risk assessment. The foundations and the message within the risk assessment should just be part of your message. Right, we're going to do this job, that's going to involve these hand tools, that hand tools, this piece of equipment, this piece of laboratory equipment, maybe the forklift, trucks, traffic management, whatever it might be. It should all just be accompanied into the conversation that's happening. Organizations that can do that are the most successful and legally compliant. Ones that feel that they're having to force health and safety into their conversations, they're a few steps behind where you might want to be, kind of thing. So in short, it's making it as natural and building it into your day-to-day life that you're almost not having to mention it because it's built in so naturally.
Really helpful. Thank you. And Donna, diving into the contract side of things, and I don't know if this is too maybe technical question, but often some of the first employees are the directors, the owners of the business, the founders themselves. So maybe what are some of the HR issues with that? I guess they're having their own employment contracts with each other. Is that a best practice? How do they manage, I guess, negotiations of things like that? Is there anything you've seen in terms of the directors as employees and how they handle that compliance side as well?
I guess, well, from a compliance perspective, it is usual for directors of a business, particularly if they're office holding directors, to have service agreements. So it's a contract of employment. It has to contain the same written particulars as is required under the Employment Rights Act, but it would contain a lot more information to protect the business, and typically more a legal document that's witnessed would be the kind of key differences between a service agreement and a standard contract of employment. They'd be looking at restrictions, perhaps tying in some restrictive covenants to protect the business should one decide to move on. I think from beyond the compliance aspect, perhaps thinking about who's going to be responsible for what within the business. So that's clear at the outset, like recruiting a new employee, thinking about your remit, agreeing that with each other. So everyone's clear where the boundaries are and who's responsible and accountable for what aspect from the business. What aspect within the business from the outset, and that might go some way in terms of avoiding conflict later on and just agreeing values. The likelihood is their values are going to be similar if they've come together to found this exciting new venture, but agreeing those early on and what's dear to them in terms of values and behaviors they'd like to see from the organization, because the organization will take the lead from them in terms of its culture. So and also agreeing, I guess, moving forward, longer term, what their recruitment plan might look like, their succession plan, how invested they're going to become in terms of, or how much investment they put into HR. HR is often seen as an admin function to begin with, but very quickly it should become a strategic function to support the business strategy and objectives, particularly if it's a accelerated growth plan over a short term.
And interesting, I think, Edward, you mentioned it earlier on. Often startup businesses might be friends, university friends, known each other for years. We've had various clients over the years that have had similar situations, but times and things change and relationships change. So the more you can have in place from Donna's world will, at the time of setting it up might not mean anything. You'll sit there and think, oh, we're never going to need this. However, it's not to say what happens in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time. Things change, unfortunately, and yeah, putting these things in place early doors can help you.
Could avoid a derailment.
Yeah.
And that actually brings me on to it's not a nice conversation to go into, but actually it is one of the things that startups bring up, in that when you do look at an early stage startup budget, actually the cost of people is the biggest thing they're spending on. So actually you're right, Donna, it is something they need to definitely invest in. And one of the biggest risks is that they maybe only have money for 1 or 2 hires. And if they get that hire wrong, that can be a real issue. So from a kind of legal and policy perspective, Donna, what happens? You're a team of founders, you've hired an engineer, they looked really good on paper, you're 6 months in and they're really not stacking up, and this is costing you every month. We've not got enough money to kind of keep this lack of performance. How do the founders deal with that?
Every new start we would typically recommend, and it's pretty much universal practice, that there's a probation period to begin with, particularly if it's someone that's unknown to them. You would want to allow a period of time for the employee to settle in, and for the employee to reach their conclusions too, that they're investing their time in the right business. So the probation period is really a two-way opportunity for both the employer to make an assessment on whether they've made that right recruitment decision, but also for the new employee to reach that decision as well, and whether the first 6 months have panned out as in line with their expectations. But certainly, recruitment mistakes do happen, and as I say, it's important to manage from an early start through that probationary period. So maybe setting regular targets, reviewing progress, whoever that individual is, whoever their line manager is, I would be having regular check-ins with them, but also setting regular review meetings, whether that be dependent on the nature of the role. Maybe that's every week to begin with, rising to fortnightly, maybe monthly, dependent on their progress. Setting clear expectations, having job descriptions in place, so everyone's clear in terms of where their roles, responsibilities, accountabilities lie. And that makes for the review discussions to reflect back on the job description, and means that if things are not working out, then both parties will soon realise if that can't be corrected by coaching, early intervention. Maybe it's a buddy system to begin with, so that person learns not only their role, but the workplace practices as well from an early stage. That can be an effective tool to help someone settle in fairly quickly. But the probationary period's there so that both parties can make that decision. And normally a probationary period might be 3 months, 6 months, depending on the role, with the ability to extend that if someone perhaps is not quite making or reaching the standards that have been set out. Then there might be the opportunity to extend that for another month. But certainly within a 6-7 month period, you'd like to think that an assessment had been made by both parties in terms of whether each had made the right choice about joining the organisation.
Excellent. So we imagine our hypothetical startup this time. So they've got their lab space, they've done this detailed risk assessment that spawned a delightful bunch of work of different types of assessments and laws they've had to look into or get expertise support. They've hired their new people, they've got their contracts, they're kind of maybe made it through the probation, fingers crossed. So maybe a couple of years in, the startup's growing and scaling. Let's talk about assurance. So it's nice to have all of these things in place. We've got our risk assessments, we've done those checks, we've got our contracts, we've got our policies, we've done the planning. There's being aware of it and then actually assuring themselves that it's happening. Maybe an investor says, we need proof that you've got all of your employment contracts in place. We want to see your health and safety. A customer says, we want to know. How would a startup approach proving that they've got all of this in place? What's best practice in terms of, frequency of checking these things? Just maybe talk to us about the practicalities of these living, breathing documents, assessments, contracts, policies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it kind of touches on the point I mentioned earlier on about when you're getting close to the end of revenue generating and dealing with clients, so to speak. It's the same. It's a kind of same point from a HSEQ, from a health and safety perspective. You've got membership portals, whether it's Achilles, whether it's Chaz from the construction industry. They basically will ask you certain questions. It'll be a membership body kind of set up, and off the back of successfully achieving that and having answered the questions, they'll give you the kind of their stamp of approval. Internationally, globally known ISO standards: 9001 for quality, 14001 for environmental, 45001 for health and safety. Other ones becoming more prominent now are like 27001 for information security management. Going through that process will give stakeholders, investors, clients, any type of stakeholder, the assurance that you've got the right things in place. That's basically what you're paying for. It's obviously not a cheap exercise. It's a significant investment for a business to go and get ISO certification, but it does what it says in the tin. You'll go through a rigorous process, meeting the requirements of the international standards, depending on which ones you go for, whether one to start with or all together at once is quite common as well. But going through that process then provides the assurance to all your stakeholders that you've got your house in order, in essence. You've got your management systems in place to help you manage, whether it's your service realization, your sales, your design elements, or your environmental management system, or your health and safety management system, for helping you make sure you're remaining legally compliant. If you have that certificate, you've signed up to that certification period, which is 3 years. You get annual visits from the certification body. The key piece of advice I always tell anyone looking at certification before, without any experience, is you get certification bodies, but you get UCAS accredited certification bodies. The difference is UCAS, they're governed, whereas non-UCAS aren't necessarily governed, and you find that there's different standards of the two. Obviously, the prices attached to that are different as well. Non-UCAS is cheaper. It's as simple as that, but it doesn't carry as much weight. If you're dealing with corporate entities or heavy-hitting stakeholders, investors, non-UCAS will probably not be an option. You pay it, you have to pay it for it, but it will in the long run set you up well and put you in a good place for kind of flying the flag of insurance and keeping yourself right on an ongoing basis.
And I guess from a people perspective, in terms of getting that assurance that maybe your managers are following the policies, procedures, and the wider workforce that you've set out, maybe just getting some feedback from the team. That might be by way of maybe a pulse survey, or simply a selection of a sample of one-to-one interviews. Just giving yourself that assurance that what we've set out in writing is actually being borne out in practice, and the policies and procedures that you've set out are actually embedded in the organisation.
I saw I think it was a TikTok or something the other day that was the corporate person who knows all the HR policies and was kind of saying nobody knows them, because then they were the person, it was a little bit of a skit, but they were saying, everyone was coming to them saying, can I do this? And they were like, yeah, policy 3.5.6, look at this, policy this. And the end of the skit was basically them saying, read the policies, know the policies, because actually there's so much you can get from it. So that is a challenge, is making sure they're aware, but hopefully these relatively small teams make it. And how often are these to be updated then as the startup's evolving? I mean, every 6 months in some of these companies, you could be having a bit of turnover, but equally a lot of new additions. I mean, some of our startups, there was one that when they joined the accelerator program, there was 4 or 5 of them. There's now 25 of them, and that's about a year and a bit later. And then some of them will be hitting, 50, 60, maybe even 100. So how do you maintain, the understanding of the policies, but equally, are they the right thing as you're scaling that business?
Absolutely. What you introduce, obviously, from day one is not going to be fit for purpose as you grow to 20, 50, 100 employees within your teams. I guess a few points. You'd certainly want to build management capability, so that they are fully aware of the policies and procedures in place, and keeping them up to date and reinforcing the different policies and that they should be following from time to time. And maybe that's just by way of, short lunch and learns every now and then. If you're rolling out a new policy, then you'd want obviously an implementation plan, management. Well, initially you'd want some feedback from management, maybe the wider workforce, depending on the subject matter of the policy that you're rolling out. But certainly you'd want management training and then maybe a wider awareness session with the group, dependent on, as I say, the area that you're setting policy in. And then perhaps looking at from an employment perspective and ensuring you remain compliant, maybe on an annual basis. Now, you're not going to be overhauling every policy on an annual basis, but as your business changes, you may be looking at the first 2-3 years, then doing another overhaul, depending on your plans in terms of growing your workforce. But certainly on an annual basis, you would be looking at checking for compliance. The employment law is made up not only of legislation, and there is some key changes ahead in the form of a big new act that's coming in. But also case law can influence and inform policy and procedure and management practice as well. So it is important if, as you say, founders have to wear a number of different hats initially, but just getting early advice to ensure you remain compliant. And as you say, the policies and procedures around the employment life cycle are fit for purpose and are helping you to attain your business objectives and to attract and retain that key talent.
Yeah. I think I've seen it both ways. I've worked in a university where there's thousands of people and there's committees and a clear structure and it's really, it's all in flow, versus if the startups are anything like me, you want to remember to do those things, add it to your to-do list, set a recurring meeting, put it in your diary that in March or October every year, you're going to have your directors meeting and you've got it in the diary invite, talk about HR policies or review risk assessment or something. Is that, yeah, I think that's one example, but I'm sure there's plenty of examples of top tips. The other one, maybe to pull Jamie in, you mentioned like toolbox talks, and you also maybe mentioned emergency response. So similar to that, maybe practical thing of booking in time in the diary to talk about these things. How are those health and safety things done? What are some practical examples of how companies keep these things on their radar, respond to accidents, learn from things that have come up?
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, the quick answer is what we just spoke about there, is that the ISO standards, if you have an ISO certification in place, you physically are forced to keep track of that. So you have document registers, you have statutory requirement registers, but you can keep track of all these things. But equally, modern technology is a wonderful thing. SharePoints, it's amazing what SharePoints can do, and it's free. If you have a Microsoft account, I think you get 1 terabyte per person, which is more than enough for most businesses. They have wonderful things you can create in there, action logs that are linked in with your emails and send automatic email reminders and things like that. But like you just mentioned there, diary invites, meetings, having a simple schedule in place where you have a list of things that need done, whether it's emergency response, drills, site inspections, internal audits, understanding what your things are that you need to do on an ongoing basis and just keeping track of them. That could be through a meeting agenda on a weekly and monthly basis. That could be through a safety committee. It could be through the admin's calendar, Outlook calendar, and it's associated with one person. Every organization is different. Every person is different, and everyone has different preferences of how it should be, and it's just figuring out what yours is, but equally keeping it simple. I would never recommend a startup business go off and create a whole fancy, well-polished, glittering SharePoint site. Do whatever's applicable to you as a business at the time, and let it grow with you as a business, because these things will, whether it's a policy, a management system, or a business, they will change as it matures, and it's just keeping on top of it.
Absolutely. And a question for both of you. Both of your disciplines have quite legal, regulatory, conditions that are very serious. How do you stay up to date? How would a business, if that's not their their main focus and they're still quite small. If an employment law change comes in or a health and safety change happens, what's the best way for them to make sure they're still up to date with it or in compliance?
Mhm. I mean, there are tools and government bodies out there to offer support. General advice, ACAS is a good resource for employers. I mean, certainly in today's times, with all the various information sources, everyone is far more aware of their employment rights than they've ever been. And there will be a lot of media attention coming up with the change overhaul in the form of this new act that's coming in. So it is important that founders do find a way to keep themselves updated. It can be tricky. I mean, we support a number of different businesses, helping them to keep up to date. It's easy for us because we've obviously got a passion. But if you're juggling all aspects of business, it's not going to be necessarily your top priority. But there are real risks to business in not complying, not only from a financial perspective, but time lost, reputation damage, damage to their employer brand for future recruitment.
And from my perspective, very similar. I mean, it pretty goes down to 2 points of from a professional perspective, as in ourselves or other health and safety professionals, it's what we do for a living. So, membership organizations like IOSH, the HSE website is a brilliant place for case studies and, recent cases and things like that. But then from from a business owner's perspective, it goes back to a point I made earlier on. It's the ownership. It's identifying the ownership within the organization. Now, that's not to say that one of the founders takes ownership of it and it's their responsibility, but that individual needs to put the right things in place, whether it's upskilling a member of staff, whether it's an external party like ourselves, on different levels. But there's different ways and means of keeping in touch with things. Again, going back to the ISO management systems, that physically forces you to keep on top of it with use of such things like legal registers and things like that. So it's key thing is it's ownership, making sure it's owned within the organization, and then figuring out the best course of action thereafter.
Brilliant. So we've explored the functional things they have to do. We've explored how they then maintain them and operate them. I guess the last theme is then around maybe training and culture and how we not just have this on paper, but kind of live it and breathe it in the organization. So from both of your point of view, maybe talk about the onboarding, whether that's for new staff or maybe someone's left for maternity leave or they've come back into the organization. What is best practice in terms of how startups can onboard or re-onboard different colleagues as they go through the process from health and safety and I guess HR as well?
Yeah. I mean, onboarding is probably one of the keyest parts of any organization from our perspective for new employees. It sets the picture, it sets the scene, sets the standard of what the expectations are from the businesses, core values, expectations, and all that kind of good stuff. Starting an onboarding pace, it has to take in consideration everything the business wants to get across, but also bearing in mind this is day one of employment. So just because you tell them on day one doesn't mean they're going to remember it next week or 6 months down the line. So you also have to think about what needs to go into your presentation on day one, the onboarding pack, whatever it may look like. But then further afield, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 a year onwards looks like from an ongoing piece, because people are people, humans are humans, human error happens, whether it's an instance or accidents or just day-to-day life. You need to put in mechanisms for managing it on an ongoing basis, and that's where your training competency comes in. Again, doesn't have to be too overly complicated, but it all stems from the onboarding process and making sure that that's right, it captures the right things. So from a for health and safety perspective, onboarding should consist of, health and safety policy statement. What is your business? What does your business do? What is its background? Where has it came from? When was it founded? How has it developed to what it is now? What activities does your business do? What if you have a workshop, a laboratory? What goes on in that workplace? What are the main hazards? What could you get hurt with the easiest? And then basics of how are things controlled? That's when you start introducing the likes of your risk assessments, your cost assessments, when the fire alarm gets tested, when drills get tested, what are your expectations as an employer on the employee to help them both remain legally compliant, because we've got to remember it's not just the employer that has legal requirements, it's also the employee has legal requirements as well. And the worst case scenario can get into trouble as well. So it's the day one onboarding piece is setting the scene, but then the business has to make sure that the ongoing piece is captured in enough detail as well.
I guess I might add, I mean, obviously, as you say, it's one of the biggest investments perhaps for certain businesses to recruit the right talent. So, some thought prior to your first or second recruit in terms of, how quickly you want that person to feel part of the organization and contributing, even staying in touch from the point of offer leading up to day one of employment, certainly setting expectations throughout the first month, 2 months, 3 months and beyond. And you've invested in this talent. It's your time that you've invested in the recruitment process and onboarding this person and thinking about beyond the onboarding period as well, career paths. So everyone's clear in terms of what the company is committed to do for this individual that's invested their career, but also the expectations from the company, from the individual.
I think just to add to Donna's point there, it's important to remember that it's a big deal for the business. It's a big investment for the business, but flip the coin, it's huge for the employee. So as much as they're selling themselves to you as part of the interview stage, you're also selling yourself and the business to the employee. And if you maybe make a mistake in some part of that, then it could be detrimental to the amount each party invests in the relationship moving forward.
It's definitely so important. I remember when I first started becoming a manager, it was an area I was really nervous about, because I know my own experience of starting somewhere new and thinking of the things I've finessed over the years. It's things like an email the week before they start with things like how to park, what to wear, where the nearest lunch options are to make them feel welcome, through to even just their desk having a little branded notebook or a little chocolate or something. It's to kind of build that culture, as well as having a proper orientation, and then lots of little coffee catch-ups with not just me, but maybe other people they're going to come across, to try and, it's the formal stuff. This is the policies, this is the health and safety, the site tour. That's all really good. But also the culture stuff as well, in terms of making them feel welcome and part of the team and know who everybody
part of the
is.
Community. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
100%.
Really
100%.
interesting.
Should never be overlooked.
And then you've got that onboarding. You've hopefully done those little things to make people welcome. What about ongoing training? And probably, I think, both sides, I guess, from HR, there's things like equality and diversity that you've brought up, maybe things like GDPR, maybe cyber policies, again, things that there's a requirement employees need to know these things, versus in HR, health and safety, probably similar, lots of things. My own experience as well, it's, you again see little memes of this, which is you see the generic e-learning thing, and it's how fast can you click the mouse through all the different slides. How do you make those possibly boring or compliance-like training actually engaging? How do you embed that? Is that something they have to all do at once, day one, fill in all these things? What have you seen that works well to get that training practical and useful?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you'll ever get away from the fact of having to cover certain basics on day one or week one to kind of not necessarily tick the box, but make sure you've got some of the basic messages across. The key thing for me is to, one, firstly manage it. So you need to identify and manage what the requirements are. But then in terms of implementation, just be sure that you're not ticking the box. I mean, from a health and safety world, there's nothing worse than an e-learning, because one, knowing, click, 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 it's bad enough as it is. If you can engage as best as possible, make it practical and real, and help spread the message in terms of why it's important. We get lots of joy with the practical hands-on training. So if we're big believers, if we develop training for any clients, potential clients, it's not death by PowerPoint, it's not e-learning, it's not sit there and listen, it's practical, it's instruction. We're we're not instructors, we're not teachers, we're facilitators, and it's actually like more of a working group style. Obviously, it depends highly on your business, your financial restraints, your capabilities, your availability as well, what resources you got in your hands. But don't be feared to do lunch and learns. It's amazing what people will do over a Domino's pizza, or and make it, but try and make it a bit more of a social event whereby you're doing it together as it's team building as much as anything else. So I always like to kind of challenge people to sort of say, well, think outside the box. Every business, every individual is different. We have clients that e-learning is perfect and it ticks all the boxes and it actually works really well. We have other clients that won't touch e-learning with a barge pole because it is just the worst thing since sliced bread. It's as simple as that. You have to just think outside the box a little bit and think what is applicable to you. And to be honest, trial and error sometimes to figure it out. So it might take a few shots.
I guess the only point I might add is, thinking everyone learns at different rates, takes information in different ways. One person, e-learning will suit them down to the ground, they'll engage with it. Others prefer in person, and certainly being part of a group, learning from each other during maybe a short participative session in person or live over Teams, you might find that people transfer the learning back to the workplace more seamlessly than a series of e-learning modules.
Yeah, that making it memorable is important. I'm a former workplace that doesn't exist anymore, so I can slag it off a tiny bit. Was I'm sure there was supposed to be some training associated with it, but I remember the manual handling, the fire safety was done through word searches and like quizzes, and well, not even quizzes. It was very much we would just find the word, fire triangle, and it was probably supposed to be the post training, fun thing to do, but we never got the actual training. So everybody just went, right, fill in this sheet, put your name at the top, tick box is done. So I can imagine for startups, especially if it's quite a small group, having that serious hat on and having to try and do formal training is difficult, but finding that fine line of lunch and learns, a little bit of pizza, let's talk about this, let's make it real, gets the job done without it being actually quite dangerous in terms of not covering the content versus something that seems like a laugh just between friends. So maybe final area then is hopefully there's this regular activities of training. There's lots of topics to cover. Probably I imagine expertise, bringing that in for some of these topics is going to be valuable, as well as having the on-site. Beyond that, what about culture? How do we create a culture of safety and of support, and how do we create a good staff and team culture in organizations?
It's probably a little bit of everything we've just mentioned. I think it's taken all the different pieces that we've been speaking about for the last wee while and embedding it within the organization, being flexible with your approach, because one size doesn't fit all, understanding individuals but also understanding the business. And it is really true what they say, seen it numerous times myself, but also as a business, that you have to lead from the top. What you, as being a founder, as being a director of the business, will speak volumes. The simple scenario in our world is if the boss can't be bothered to put his safety boots on to work and walk into the workshop, why should I bother? And that is so true in so many respects. You have to lead from the top is probably the key thing from the health and safety side.
And I guess there's building the early culture, but then as the organization develops, that commitment from line managers as well, making sure they're bought into your values and behaviors, and they lead and follow the leadership team's example. Will be important. And also, mistakes happen in terms of recruits. If there's any sign of any toxicity in terms of behaviors, you want to make an early intervention in there before the positive, inclusive workplace culture you strived hard to develop and maintain and sustain unravels. I think line managers they play such a critical role. People from retention, that early positive relationship with your line manager can make such a difference to the workplace experience.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add in is before you start talking about culture, you need to understand what it is you're actually wanting. What is the culture you're looking for in the organization? Don't get me wrong, there's good culture, there's bad culture, setting an example, but you kind of need to understand what are you actually working towards. Yeah. What's it look like? What is your business's culture? Especially nowadays, you've got lots of different businesses that are pushing the boundaries. Sort of early on with Brewdog, they were very loose and very rebel-like, but then you still have the corporate entities that are very policy driven and very black and white in terms of their approach to things. So where do you sit on that spectrum of the type of business that you want to be?
I guess building trust early on, demonstrating as an employer you're committed to that individual's career, but not also they're, thinking about well-being as well, what resources you have in place there, what well-being benefits that you might put in place, and continuing to review those as part of your reward and recognition plan.
Lovely. And I think so much interesting topics there around that culture piece and making sure that it's not just an afterthought, it is so part. And I think as startups change, quite rightly, those early stages, it is about a culture of curiosity, about experimentation. And in some cases that could be dangerous. You are in a lab and you are experimenting and you are trying something that's brand new, but making sure that from the top, there is a sense of this is where the red line is. We want your job is to come up with new things and to try things, but it has to be done in this safe way.
Exactly. It has to fit the image. I mean, part of our business is health and safety. For a social event, it's highly unlikely we're going to go axe throwing, as an example, because it has to fit the image of your business. And there'll be lots of businesses out there that want to be more Brewdog, like I mentioned, but it won't fit their what they actually do as a business. So again, it's finding that right space of where you fit.
Excellent. So I think that's us pretty much almost out of time, but I think a lot of really interesting things, and I'm maybe overly simplifying startups, but because the ones I work with, they are so passionate about they have to raise funding or they're building the technology. Sometimes it maybe seems like these topics are an afterthought, but they are part of that foundation building bricks of the business that they're creating, and it will outlive, that experiment that they're doing. If they don't get the health and safety right or the hiring right, there is no business to continue. So I think we've explored a lot of that. We've explored the legal responsibilities, getting that risk assessment right, doing all those various assessments as needed, getting the contracting right, looking at IP, through to then the processes. Maybe that's toolbox talks, maybe that's policy checking in, maybe that's meetings, through to how we onboard staff, train them, make it engaging, that startups can be thinking about. So I imagine if I was a startup, it probably does require maybe a big founder planning day and just sitting down and going, right, what is our health and safety policy? What are our rules? What is our processes? So that they get it all done, and then figuring out, and maybe the same with thinking, right, okay, we raised 10 million investment. What is the plan? We're going to hire these people, or we're going to have these policies. And but equally knowing that great expertise is out there to rely on as well.
Absolutely.
This is it. And I think the key leading message from me is probably on that note is figuring out what you need to do as a business, but how are you actually going to do it? And taking the simplest approach that enables you to still do what your business is supposed to do, and concentrate on that.
Excellent. Any final thoughts, topics that you haven't covered today that come up in your day-to-day, that if you were an early stage startup, top tips, bit of advice, anything else that we haven't covered?
I guess I did maybe touch on this a little, but thinking from an early stage, retention plans, thinking about setting out career pathways. They're key people that you need to retain to grow and scale up your business and attract others to join as well. So thinking about their careers from an early stage, what that looks like, what journey they will go on as the business grows, will be important. And also thinking about, your recognition plans, recognizing those people, not just from a financial perspective, but recognizing those people that are contributing significantly into your business.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, it's keeping things simple. if at any point you find yourself standing there scratching your head thinking, I've got no idea what I'm doing here, you need to cry for help and seek the right help, whether, like you say, whether it's through third-party organizations, third-party businesses, specialists, whatever it might be. The last thing and the worst thing for your business is to be spending time on stuff that you're not an expert in or a specialist in. That's not what you were kind of creating your business for. So it's being able to have that ability to take a step back and understand that what you need when you need it.
Really interesting closing messages, because it's just fresh in my head. I was at an event just before this with Mark Logan, who used to be the chief operating officer of Skyscanner, and two things he said at that event were, one, people often criticize Scotland, and startups say we can't recruit the right talent. You need to move to London, or you need to move to Silicon Valley to get the talent. And he was saying how in Scotland, if you get the retention right and you offer the right opportunities, you can have people who will stick with you for longer, because it is a really great quality opportunity. Whereas in Skyscanner, when they moved and set up a London office, they were struggling. They were having 9-month cycles of really great people, but the opportunities were richer. So that retention, can be a strength. And he also mentioned how one of the challenges they had with their engineers was they were too afraid to break things in the coding and the development of it, and actually were overcomplicating things and kind of too worried about keeping it. So keeping it simple, making sure that actually they knew what they could and couldn't do, was one of the things that he was sharing as well. So it's come up a lot in our conversations today, from not just early stage startup, but even a company that scaled up to sell for £1 billion has these same challenges that they went through. So thank you both so much, to Jamie and Donna from Quensh. Appreciate your time. And I'm sure we'll see you again with some of our startups on our next cohort of our TechX Accelerator, which is a UK-wide startup program trying to help energy technologies get funding, training, and access to scale the most exciting energy support. So thank you so much. This is part of our EnergyTech Essentials series of podcasts and information with our partners to help startups find out a little bit more about the operations of their businesses. So there'll be plenty more to come. Thank you so much to our partners today, and we will see you again for the next.